is really one of his prizes. It's an incredibly famous painting, and I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about that and how it came to be this morning. So there was y'all don't know him, but there's kind of Al Lowen, who was a very famous sort of social historian, literary gadflies that worked mainly out of San Marcos at South Texas. But he would go up to Austin and down to San Antonio, and he and Charles the definitive biography of writer called Hudson. He was from El Paso, the Oak Pass. It's a he was a huge member how Lowen was of the Texas State Historical Society, that he wrote the definitive works on many people. He was a close friend of Tom Lee. He was a close friend of Carl Herzog. He wrote in all of Tom Lee's numerous paintings, watercolors, etc. He said there were really three that stood out. One was the portrait of J. Frank Dobie, who kind of ruled the mid-American 20th century of Western literature. Dobie and Tom Lee fell out. You all may know the story that Tom Lee got befriended by the King Ranch people. So they wined and dined him, and they became very good friends. And they asked Tom Lee, not Frank Dobie, to like the history of the King Ranch. So there's a famous 2-volume King Ranch book. Then written by and illustrated by Tom Lee, not by J. Frank Dobie. When they came out, and it's reviewed in the New York Times by J. Frank Dobie. Who they said it was, he said pretty bad, and it's about it caused a schism with Dobie. And Tom Lee's reputation early on was made by J. Frank Dobie and Apache Knoll and Donkey Silver, some early Tom Frank Dobie books were illustrated by anyway, they broke up for like 20 years. 20 years later, Dobie wrote an apologetic letter, but this portrait is considered one of the finest. Second, there's this scene is a ranger escort west of the pages, which I'm going to say is a very cool picture. But the third is the one that we're interested in today, which is the official title is the first recorded social operation in North America, Comeste Vaca, 1535. So let's get right into it. So really the story of the painting is the story of four men. And talk about an unlikely project to prepare for this talk. Four men in the society, all which are, the first is 400 years ago, all our Nunez come in and said, the second is Dr. Ronald Sparkling, who is the editor. He was I'll tell you about it in a little bit. The third is Carl Herzog, the player of the past, kind of an eccentric, sound like the guy that you'd want to go on a weekend trip to Las Vegas with. Very, didn't mind drinking, but so funny and so talented and so stubborn. And then our hero, Tom Lee, who was this more amazing to where you were about this. And then the Texas Surgical Society, which was the was part of a package deal at the society asked me to do some sort of painting, perhaps about Comeste Vaca, but also to design the seal for the society. So looking at old Comeste Vaca first, his name is Alvar Nunez Comeste Vaca. And his in the literature, you'll see something calling him Mr. de Vaca or Comeste, but with a Comeste Vaca, because this is his entire last name. So Comeste de Vaca is incorrect, but it does mean cow's head, and that's correct in Spanish. He came from an old, respected Spanish family, but really not much is known about Chico Mike. He apparently was in civil work in Leeds, which he got the attention of the Spanish crown. But we really don't know that for sure. That was her fragmentary. He was part of the ill-fated Narvaez expedition to explore Florida. In Gulf of Mexico, down to Mexico in 1528. After this terrible ordeal, he went back to Spain and sort of was a hero and wrote a very, very salient literary / military account of the expedition in this Narvaez and carrying this operation. In 1542, it's it's really good literature in this it's just quite a little over. It is a very humbling account of what he went through and the way he was able to describe it objectively. Years later, because of the dark, because he had done so well in surviving the Norvise expedition, assigned to be governor of Paraguay, but he got sort of on the wrong side of some politics. He was arrested. He was convicted of treason, not executed, and he was later pardoned. Basically, he died of obscurity, but in 15 to 16. So that's his life. I mean, our attention today is the Narvaez expedition, and it's hard to find the Narvaez expedition described in the literature without it being called the Gilly Fated. If the Narvaez expedition cut Porphyria, they were basically given the task to explore, conquer, and settle Florida and Mexico. And I think if you were the Spanish government at that time, everyone had a pretty broad mandate to explore, conquer, and settle. So the slave trade was a big thing. It was conquest, pure and simple, but also a lot of exploration. So they would, Commission of Naka really was, he focused more on the exploration and the conquest aspects of the expedition. By this time, Commission of Naka's reputation had read that he was treasurer of the whole operation and second in command. And the Spanish crown kept close tabs after Cortez's spectacular niches found in Mexico. And they thought that settling North America was going to be that easy, where the Indians just come think you're a god and walk over and then just lie down, and that they will all have this gold waiting for you. So the treasure was very important because the conquistadors at the upper level were oftentimes siphoned off either power, military, or gold for themselves. So the treasure was there to keep things straight for the crown. In 1527, it left Spain with about 600 men, numerous ships, probably about 8. And they held the fatal mistake of exploring the Indies, the West Indies, the Gulf of Mexico during hurricane season. So in November, they hit hurricane in Cuba. They hadn't even landed in Florida yet. They lost 2 boats of 60 men. They decided to win in Cuba. And next April, they started heading north up the east coast of up the west coast of Florida. We gave it Tampa Bay. After they found Tampa Bay, and rather than having nice rocky or soft terrain like they had in Mexico, they did to Mexico City. They found a bunch of swamps. The bay was too shallow for their boats. Too deep to waterfalls. The Indians were not happy. They were pissed off. They were expert. A lot of marksmen with their bows and arrows. The bows were about as tall as they were. And the one description of Commission of Naka's was that they would and the Spaniards would come off in their arm. They said that many armored, and they said the Indians would shoot by field whenever metal there was. So it was, and then they would disappear into the brush. So they were at a strategic disadvantage and quite surprised by the reception they got from the Indians. They did, but however, that Narvaez's problem was they would shoot first and talk later. So they were not really defending the Indians in the first place. And that sensation, that sentiment was reciprocated by the Indians. In May, Narvaez, this is a highly criticized move. He decided to divide his troops, and part of them would go to Narvaez and then his troops, and they would march because the Indians, they knew that the Spaniards weren't gold. And so when the Spaniards would arrive in the forts, the Indians say, well, we don't have any, but right up the road here, there is a con that just has exactly what you're looking for. Really, eat the gold, women, whatever. So they would go in and that's trying to do the same thing. And so they were looking for this to debate so that they had on a May to September march through the swamps and busing down, attacked by India, was very little food, no gold. and they were finally sort of driven off the coast of Florida, and they got to the Panhandle, and they were just stuck. They couldn't want to go inland. They had lost their ships. The ships had tried to find them, and then they went out to Cuba. So they had a certain number of people, maybe a couple hundred that around the Cuban Panhandle, and they decided we need to build some boats and get out of here. That their thought was we're sitting ingeniously lashing boats together. They knew how to make pitch out of their tree tar, and they would have like 40 men in the barge, and there was this much. It would sink down. There'd be this much what they called freeboard between the top of the boats. And then they got hit by a hurricane, so all of them were killed, the most destroyed. In November, these boats had somehow been swept across to around Galveston Bay, and from Maine, it was felt that the landing was made in Galveston Bay. It's probably just over Salween Pass into Matagorda Island areas. Eventually, the 600 men that Narvaez expedition, there were only 4 that walked out alive some years later. So, some Galactus, one of them, so he was picked up by the Karankawa Indian tribes. It's been described as that really in a late Stone Age existence, they had extremely primitive dwellings, just lean-tos. However, they had no crops, no cultivations, no domestic animals they can gain. They basically lived going down the fourth of the night barrier islands with mainland and eating what they could, including scorpions, rats, tarantulas. Their happiest time of the year was when the quickly carried tuna crops came a little bit further south, and they would go and eat the tunas for it was. That was just the best thing they'd ever had. To make a very long story short, Tabistavakas spent 7 years with the Indians. And the Karankawas are about the one homogeneous tribe. They had sets which were had to boot steal from each other. They would fight with each other. There were Tabistavakas' description is fairly precise from a sociological point of view. For South of the Karankawas, if they had a female baby, they would toss that baby to the dogs, because they were either they didn't want any females. They were just overpopulated. There was one more after fleeing. They had nipple rings and lower cheek rings they would put wood through. That was what the men would wear for declaration. The Narvaez expedition really is documented best in Tabistavakas' book. That basically they started in San Domingo, later named Cuba, went to Tampa, up to Appalachia, where the Appalachian Mountain name came from, and they were blowing across the mouth of Mississippi. Now, I guess they were going along, and when they're going from Appalachia on their little homemade boats to the mouth of Mississippi, they basically had no water to drink. They ran out of their fresh water early on, and they said, one of the descriptions is of sailors who would just go crazy, drink seawater, and die, and he's tossed overboard. When they hit the Mississippi River, they said all of a sudden there was fresh water in the sea, and they're just enjoying there straight as much of the fresh water as they could. The Mississippi, unfortunately, brought them the strong enough that it pushed them out to sea, and that's where they were actually shipwrecked out in Galveston. They went from tribe to tribe down to the south part of Texas, and they were almost to civilization in Mexico when this is the 4 of them now, and coming to the history columns, they decided, we probably do better following the Rio Grande. So they couldn't get about 150-mile route to Mexico, became about 1,500 miles over the next couple of years. Somewhere around South Texas, the Indians wanted them to become healers, saying the way that the traditional Indian medicine was that they would blow if you had sore and they'd blow on the wound, and they would to cut at the wound, they'd suck the wound, that was pretty much it. And so basically Marquette and his associates would, and I said, you was the healers? And I said, yes. And they said, you don't know anything about healing. They said, okay, no more food. So after 4 or 5 days of no food, and they said, well, we have some healing at their motive. So they started blowing on the wounds and sucking on the wounds. And they were extremely religious, as you can imagine, with death being such a part of your life. They would do the Pater Noster, the Maria's, and the sign of the cross, and so on. And unbelievably, almost everyone they did this treatment to, they said, I feel great. And just, it was amazing. So their reputation kind of grew. And somewhere around the rear end, and they ended up doing this operation all did too. So we got home, we wrote a Relacion, and then this is the text on which this is like that has exploded in the pages of literature like speculation. It's really not a very big paragraph, but this is his description of it. And it's a pretty good op-note. This is that. When you think about it, because there's how many million op-notes in histories of physicals, basically he starts out, he says they brought a man to me here, and they told me a long time ago he had been wounded by an arrow, the right side of his back. Some people will say shoulder, but when they use the spaldo, so his back is the better trend. And the arrowhead was over his heart. He said that it gave him much pain. He was always sick because of it. That's a pretty, nearly that's more of a history in the air to find in the EHRs today. CC, diagnosis codes 1.00, even the physical. He said, I touched and felt the arrowhead and saw that it had passed through the cartilage. A lot has been made of this anatomically, but basically that's all he said. Then he has ob-note. With the knife I had, I opened his chest for that place. We don't know what that place was, but and saw that the point had passed through and was very bad to remove. I resumed cutting and inserting the tip of the knife, and with a great effort, I finally removed it. Findings. It was very long, but it had a few words. Then he describes his closure of the weight close, and this is what I've done a billion times, and any surgeon has. But using my experience in medicine, I made 2 stitches with a deer bow, and making them, I was bled upon. And I stopped the blood with hair straight from behind. And the hair straight from behind is probably like using a Surgicel out of a jelly. Not good. Surgicel was the powdery stuff, and you packed it to a wound, cost the patient $100. I think that's not the same as if you just waited. And then he went out and talked to the family. When the point had been removed, they asked me for it, and I gave it. And the whole village came to see it. It said it furthered inland so that those who were there could see it. They had many dances and celebrations over this, as they usually do. And then he describes the hospital course. So the next day, I cut the Indians 2 stitches, and he was well. It did not seem that the wound was made there was less than the mind of a palm of hand, about like that. And he said that he felt no pain and had no problems. And then follow up. And this was like, could be in the first artificial heart, and they used it to rose. The cure name was so standing among them throughout the whole land, as much as they were able to know how to value and praise. So they were certainly locally famous because of this. The book, Relacion, in that description, does about in general the human, but since generally just in the last. There are actually 40 books, numerous summaries, many references to that literature. There have been several English translations of La Relacion. A lot of the translations are over-dramatized. From Cabeza Marco's like, how about you? Everybody, astronauts are going to the moon, and everybody you'd have been reports by the astronauts. They're all this very good. But they were not over-dramatizing their endpoints of moving. Cabeza Marco's very much in that genre. Kids should not write an album. The many English translations of La Relacion have this is a great story, and bringing I'm going to bend it a little bit to my devices, like people who tend to like the Indians, but the Indians are terrible. People who are sympathetic to the Indians, they didn't look great. The wrong. Kevin Locke, he was playing language. He was obviously a keen and very sensitive observer. And it is kind of a reenaction of that where he in this plays and he was that articulate 500 years ago. He was truly curious, observant, energetic, and resourceful, and tough. The translation is the one I used for this presentation. The one I liked the best is this one was he says, he says, all these translators have not been translated in engagement to their desires. And so it is, as Tom Lee says, so this is sort of the first connection I have between Tom Lee, especially, and so Capizzi-Vaca, Lee makes the point that he kind of paid in most there. He learned El Paso, he loved that West Texas, Southern New Mexico area. He said, we don't need to add much to it. It's just great the way it is. He said, I want to bring glory upon myself. I want to try to be as representational as possible. Kevin Stutfield, and Lee's famous quote was, let the thing speak for itself. I'm not here to brag on it. This is what it is. And Capizzi-Vaca pretty much said, this is what it is. It's not politically correct until it's truly correct. But it is incredible. Even though into the blood, just killed it barley. So 4 people, Capizzi-Vaca, Sparkman, Herzog, and Tom Lee. Did ask is Robert Sparkman. Robert Sparkman was born in Brownwood, and she went to medical school in Dallas. I don't know if you remember the Baylor in Houston. It was Baylor in Dallas before they had a sort of political fight, and the Baylor trustees got pissed off and went to Houston. But he was a Baylor medical school graduate in Dallas. He became very outstanding surgeon at the Baylor Medical Center in Dallas. He kind of dominated academic surgery in the mid-20th century. He was editor of American Journal of Surgery. He married Melick Sykes, and she was very social. He was very social. We were both smart, kind of bibliophiles. And then Mitchell. And so Barbara and I have 4 children. So there's, to tell you where our attention goes over the years. But so the social fashion, literature, collecting, and comments that were in medicine or associated became their children. He was the editor at Texas Social Society. I'll get to that in a minute. He was the editor of that book and president in 1965, which was the 50th year of the union of the Texas Social Society. He was good friends. Spark was good friends with a guy named Pat Nixon. Pat Nixon wrote the definitive history of the Texas Medical Association. He was a living good 20th century medical historian of Texas, very, very well known, good writer. And Pat Nixon did that history in his family, the Nixons of Texas, that Carl Herzog, that was the well-known El Paso printer, and had printed for it. So he thought that highly of it. Pat Nixon was a member of the Texas Social Society and good friend. Spark, but was Pat Nixon was on the committee to write the 15-year celebration book. And he said, Bill, everybody down there can print it, and that's called Herzog from El Paso. Sparkman knew of Tom Lee, but we didn't know him personally. I think he got to know Carl Herzog early on in the publication of Herzog and looking towards the anti-system 50th year. But then he died on the settlement district focus. So Tom Lee and Carl Herzog were kind of two boundaries that they were in El Paso guys. They did not live necessarily saintly lives. They had they were kind of struggling for a living. They both kind of came of age in the Depression years, the 1930s. And Lee knew about Galveston and Herzog knew too how they go about, well, they were hired in the 30s to write some menu illustrations, some menus and some menu illustrations for the Del Norte Hotel Campo Modesto. It's one of the ones that they fit in for the menus at that time. Our manuscript that would be worth right now. And that's been used over and over again in scenarios that this was obviously kind of step off that history of payments. So the Smartphone had reached out to Tom Lee, and he had talked to her son, and John mentioned, would Tom Lee do Rinser Conscious? And at this point, Tom Lee had 2 books made it to Ho and Bunnies. He was a very high flyer rate. I mean, he was working on The Hands of Cantu, which is one of his famous books. And so it sparked him carefully, so he wrote to it. It was essentially the explanation about the Texas Surgical Society. And Texas Surgical Society is a very small, selective society started in 1915. It had been a very controversial time in medicine when surgeons could, in fact, get charged more for a case than a general practitioner if it made him 6 months. We're starting to separate from the general practice. But it was controversial because the Texas Surgical Society did not have to be fully committed to having surgeries or only practice. It couldn't be general practice as well. The general practitioners hated this, felt they were elitist, and so the Texas Surgical Society in 1915 was organized as a small 50-member league with extremely high requirements for a fellowship. It has continued to be that way. It's the last most prestigious state surgical society in America, and it's still blowing on. And the current king father, James Hobson, the original general publisher, was founding president. There's a very strong history and relationship between UTMB and the surgical side. So basically, this is just the letters in October, formally asking Colony if you would do a panel for the book, and maybe a little insignia. And says we wish you to prepare a painted or drawing to the beginning of the book, also a small insignia or symbol along the lines suggested by the rough diagram. And then he says the operation performed like Cabeza de Vaca is so notable in the history of surgery. I should like to see your original currently at one of our Texas Dental Libraries, which is here, which you'll see shortly. Hope to find $1. So all of this came true. Then Sparkman he was a little fastidious, and he really questioned the analysis. So he thought he'd give Tom Lee a few suggestions about how they used to do the painting, which I'm sure Lee is just thinking, I really. He says, it occurs to me that the illustration might be more lucid if it depicted the conclusion of the operation rather than the actual search for the arrowhead. This would allow the artist to show the arrowhead would be removed and to make it up to close the balloon, blah, blah, blah. So silence, crickets from Tom Lee for 7 months. And then the next, and this is October, the next May. And remember, this is back in 1964 in May. And the book has to be out in about a year and don't publish it. So Dr. Sharp, thanks to your letter, he says, I'm giving up all correspondence while I'm trying to finish The Hands of Cantu. He says, all the information they're not operating on the Indian is all under this, and I will get to it one of these days. I was not sure this may spiking all over each valley. So that's what things left. Now, then the catalyst, the kidding spot and they together was Carl Herzog, the trader. And I must say, Carl Herzog's biography is written by Al Lohman, remember that guy that talked with the 3 Miss Tom Lee Pennage. Al Lohman was Carl Herzog's biography, and that book itself is one of the, he's the player past. He was a people would come to him as eccentric as he was, stuff and unlovered. This is a picture of Tom Lee and Herzog. Is that it older? but so and so Sparkman and Herzog had a good working relationship. Herzog's introduced the idea, says Tom wants me to find some models to pose as Cabeza in the station. So the initial correspondence between Sparkman and Herzog and Tom Lee especially was there, Mr. Lee, it's for the Norbert Sparkman Committee. Willie Sparkman and Sparkman went out to El Paso somewhere around June or July 1964, and all of a sudden, and apparently they had them blast together. And then from then on, it was chumming, very familiar letters, and dear, dear and Tom, enjoyed your fine letterings. We enjoyed the fine visit with you and Willie, maybe El Paso. We look forward to more! Exclamation point. Hope your trip was good, and blah, blah, blah. We haven't certainly seen Herzogs since that evening at their house. Herzogs did store alcohol at their house, and this is a naked romantic story. I you kind of wish you'd been there. I haven't done anything more on Mount Cabeza since you and Carl told us. So Carl Herzog and Tom Lee and Sparkman were the main. This is whether from Sparkman to Tom Lee, and they're talking about footnotes and the published with Denmark translation. And he says, one author says having to read footnotes is like going downstairs to answer the door, opening back. He says, another author says that translation is like women. If beautiful are seldom true, and if true are seldom beautiful. So I mean, their relationship was obviously flourishing with Mr. In 1978, after the book was published and having great reception, the story of how really Tom Lee became not only agreeing to do the painting of Cabeza de Vaca, actually enthusiastic about it, was in a letter that Carl Herzog, retrospective bid, wrote Spark. I'm just going to, this has some great points. Says, for some reason, I don't understand the revival of activity about Cabeza de Vaca. There was a lot being published on at that time, irritated me. I thought I owed him. He says, as soon as I was committed to do the book, you said, now I want to come keep drawing. And assigned me a job and didn't get interested. I delayed a couple of weeks. Herzog knew Lee very well to work on an approach. If you or I or both of us had gone out to see him and told him we were going to do a history of the Surgical Society and wanted a Tom Lee drawing, I think he would have declined. After sleeping on it for a week or so, I got an idea of how to sneak up on him. I went out to see Tom, a casual visit, and talked right on to Tom. You remember that episode when Cabeza was traveling west with the 4,000 Indians following him, which is probably true. He had built up a reputation as a sailor, and then bought him this guy with an arrow in it, lodged next to his heart. Of course, Tom answered yes. And I continued, I guess he was pretty sick. We checked it the rest of the while, and then I asked, don't you think that would make it a bad picture? He began to envision this picture, and only then to tell him that we had a book project that would like to have a Tom Lee illustration in the book. Then how's that for salesmanship? Well, in the beginning, I don't think you had any idea of what kind of a picture we would get. I think that's true. You wouldn't, and just wanted Tom Lee. When he asked me, asked your surgeon friend if he was operating the front or the back. I knew he was. And I went out later and posed for the preliminary sketch. I was at India. When Tom got to working on the picture, he hired a couple of Mexicans to come out in the buffaloes. He was intrigued with the project and put more and more into it. It was understood that it was going to be $1,000 drawing, but Tom was fascinated on the subject and he forgot about the price. At this time, he was working on a new technique with his Chinese egg, and he decided to use it on Cabeza. He'd used it in a book, The Hands of Cantu, which explained the way in correspondence. So, and just for the technocrats here, this black ink is in a small block consecrated and extremely strong, and in addition to using a pen, he made up a wash which he would apply with a brush or a special paper sort of brush. Since he penned several drawings for Cantu, he made up a job wash. When he went to use it a few days later, it was sour. It had spoiled, but it was long. This little black pot was supposed to be 1,000 years old, and it was still alive. Perhaps that is why Tom's drawing is so charged with action and eerie atmosphere. Before he finished, it became a $5,000 painting, which $50,000 into back to $64. And the deal was the deal, and Thomas paid the $1,000. However, it has achieved a permanent place of honor in the corridors of the Tesla Snuff Controlling Galveston, along with Tom's portrait that oils of Astro's death. No doubt this is more than you expected, blah, blah, blah. But with photo computer toxicity in this rapidly changing world, who has time to read when a tobacco chewing clamp printer remembrance to pin. So they were most kind of cozy characters. You kind of wanted to be sitting in on their conversations. So the commonalities really have convinced vodka and sparkling and Herzog and Lenny and really, Benedict, God, they were talented, energetic men. And that's character. We all know people like that. And just all talk to them because they're so full of themselves. They were living out like that, not wanting to school. They had real lives and real families. They had kind of a charming integrity and wear off their shoulders, but they had it, and anybody who was with them for this much time knew it. And they're fundamentally generous spirits. If you ever do read the Cabeza de Vaca, not how Mavacio is, it's an incredible description of the Native American population at that time, studying on a number of levels. They took their work seriously. They didn't take it so seriously. There were people really that had biblical virtues for the ages, and these are the same qualities, really, those sometimes unspoken, well, unwritten qualities that could make when you ask somebody who would you go to for an operation and you ask a surgeon, they're not running through their number of publications, they're not reading, they're like going through their titles or their offices. They don't make sense of that. Not really has the qualities that mean sport and fist. And those men are said in test social leadership. So this is so Tom lay off. So like that, well, that's because he really wanted to be true to life. And so actually make a spark that hurts on the toad's forward. And again, the people's analysis. This was his preliminary sketch, and I've got to copy this that Kelly was kind enough to print up for us for inch at all today. This says that the working drawing of all of our images Cabeza de Vaca from my friend Margaret Stockbank, who himself showed me by posing for the hands on this figure rapidly how far the Benitez must have performed the surgical work of removing the heroin sick on one's chest in the year 1535 with that to regard. So that's it. So test surgical for $1,000 got this picture and our insignia and then test surgical sign. And then think of this, the totally admit if you look at this test surgical society founded in 1915, Cabeza de Vaca, the first Texas surgeon, has the cow's head, the star in Texas, and they go and tolerate royalty last year. At having been secretary at Test Surgical Society for 5 years, and then goes, I can't tell you the number of times the ring send this to a trainer. And they'll always correct the things. Yes, that send it. Say, no, that's on purpose. It's on purpose. It's broken up. So that's it.